James Anderson sat in his corner office, high above the bustling streets of New York City, the skyline stretching out before him like a promise fulfilled. The walls of his office were adorned with awards, plaques, and framed newspaper clippings highlighting his most significant cases, each a testament to his skill, cunning, and unyielding drive. But today, none of it brought him the satisfaction it once had. The man who had once relished the thrill of the courtroom now felt a hollow ache where his ambition used to burn. James had everything he had ever wanted: a thriving law firm, a reputation that demanded respect, and wealth that allowed him any luxury he desired. Yet, as he stared out at the city, he couldn't shake the growing sense of emptiness that had taken hold of him. The realization that his success had come at the cost of something far more valuable gnawed at him. He had spent years surrounded by people who smiled to his face, but whose motives he had come to mistrust. It was this distrust that led him to his decision, a decision that had been festering in the back of his mind for months. What if he could see the world as it truly was, stripped of all pretense and artifice? What if he could test the integrity of those around him, to see who they were when they thought no one was watching? The thought had consumed him, and now he was ready to act. That evening, James stood in front of his mirror, hardly recognizing the man staring back at him. Gone were the tailored suits and perfectly coiffed hair. In their place, he wore tattered clothes he had picked up from a thrift store, his hair unkempt, his face unshaven. He had transformed himself into someone unrecognizable, a man who could walk the streets without turning a single head. James Anderson, the celebrated attorney, would disappear for a while. In his place would be someone entirely different. A homeless man with nothing to his name but the clothes on his back and the stories he chose to share. He had rented a small, dingy apartment in a rundown part of town, where he would live out this new identity. He planned every detail meticulously, ensuring that no one would recognize him or question his disappearance. His colleagues at the firm were told he was taking a much-needed sabbatical, a lie that only a few doubted. The truth was, he needed to step away from everything that defined him to see if there was anything left underneath. The first day was the hardest. James wandered the streets, feeling the weight of his new life pressing down on him. The cold wind cut through his thin jacket, a stark contrast to the warmth he had grown accustomed to. People avoided his gaze, stepping around him as if he were invisible. It was a harsh, humbling experience that left him questioning his decision. But as the days passed, he began to see things he had never noticed before. The kindness of strangers, the cruelty of others, and the indifference that filled the spaces in between. It was during one of these days that he stumbled upon a charity auction, held in a grand, historic building that seemed out of place in the neighborhood he now called home. The event was a glittering affair, attended by the city's elite, all dressed in their finest, bidding on items that would raise money for various causes. James knew he didn't belong there, not in the way he once would have, but he was drawn to it, curious to see if the wealthy were as generous as they claimed to be when the cameras were off. He lingered on the outskirts of the event, watching as people mingled, exchanged pleasantries, and made bids. No one paid him any mind, which suited him just fine. He was content to observe, to gather the information he needed to judge the character of those in attendance. That's when he noticed them, two women who stood apart from the rest. They weren't the loudest or the most ostentatious, but there was something about them that caught his attention. They seemed different, less concerned with appearances and more focused on the cause at hand. As the evening wore on, the auction items became more extravagant, the bids higher, and the atmosphere more competitive. James, blending into the background, continued to watch. He noticed the moment when one of the women, a brunette with kind eyes and an air of quiet confidence, excused herself from the conversation she was in and approached the refreshment table, where a man in a server's uniform struggled with a heavy tray. James could tell the server was new, perhaps overwhelmed by the demands of the job. The tray wobbled dangerously, and before James could even consider stepping in, the woman reached out to steady it, offering the man a warm smile and a few words of encouragement. Her actions were subtle, almost imperceptible to those wrapped up in their own world, but they didn't escape James's notice. The second woman, taller with an elegance that suggested old money, joined her friend, and together they continued to assist the server, ignoring the disapproving glances from other guests. It was a simple act, one that didn't involve bidding thousands of dollars or making grand gestures, but it struck James as profoundly genuine. He followed them as they left the refreshment table, their conversation light and easy, their bond apparent. He didn't know who they were or why they were different, but he intended to find out. For the first time since he had taken on this disguise, James felt a flicker of something other than emptiness, a curiosity, perhaps even hope, that there were still people who could see beyond the surface. And so, as the night drew to a close and the last of the guests began to depart, James made a decision. He would find a way into the lives of these women, learn their secrets, and see if they were as sincere as they seemed. What he didn't know was that in doing so, he was about to uncover a truth far more complicated and dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The next morning, James woke early in his dingy apartment, the morning light filtering weakly through the grimy window. The small space, with its peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of mildew, was a far cry from his luxury penthouse. But this was the reality he had chosen, a life stripped of all its comforts and excesses. As he dressed in the same tattered clothes, he couldn't help but think of the women from the auction, Sarah and Lauren. Their names, as he had overheard during the event, echoed in his mind. The memory of their genuine kindness stuck with him, urging him to learn more. He knew that if he wanted to uncover who they really were, he would need to get closer, but doing so without revealing his true identity would require careful planning. James spent the day blending into the city's background, watching the people around him with a critical eye. He observed the way they interacted with those they considered beneath them, their casual dismissals, their hurried steps past anyone who looked out of place. It was a harsh reminder of the world he had once navigated with ease, but now it felt foreign, like a place he could no longer call home. By late afternoon, he found himself back in the area near the auction house, drawn to it by some unspoken instinct. The event was long over, but James hoped he might cross paths with Sarah or Lauren again. As he walked down the street, head down and hands stuffed into his worn coat pockets, he spotted a familiar figure leaving a cafe. It was Sarah, her brunette hair pulled back into a casual ponytail, a stack of papers clutched under one arm. He watched her from a distance, noting the way she moved through the crowd with a sense of purpose, but without the arrogance that often accompanied those who knew they were being watched. She seemed almost oblivious to the attention she might draw, her focus entirely on the papers she was reviewing. James hesitated for a moment, then made his decision. He followed her at a safe distance, careful not to draw any attention to himself. He was no longer James Anderson, the successful attorney. He was just another face in the crowd, invisible and unremarkable. As she continued walking, it became clear she was heading toward a nearby park, a small green space nestled between the towering buildings. Once there, Sarah settled on a bench, spreading the papers out on her lap and beginning to work. James found a spot nearby, partially hidden by the shadow of a large oak tree, where he could watch without being seen. He studied her carefully, noting every detail. The way she frowned slightly as she concentrated, the way she occasionally paused to look up, lost in thought, before returning to her task. It was clear she was deeply engrossed in whatever she was working on, and it only fueled James's curiosity. As the minutes ticked by, a sudden realization hit him. He had no idea what he was actually searching for. He had set out to test the integrity of those around him, but now that he was here, observing this woman who had shown nothing but kindness, he couldn't pinpoint what exactly he hoped to find. Did he want to prove that even the seemingly good had hidden motives? Or was he simply looking for a reason to believe that genuine people still existed? Lost in these thoughts, James almost missed the arrival of the second woman. Lauren approached from the opposite direction, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that contrasted with the casual attire of the park's other visitors. She moved with the grace and confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention, yet her smile as she greeted Sarah was warm and sincere. James's interest peaked as he watched them interact. They spoke in low tones, their conversation casual at first, but quickly growing more serious. James strained to hear, inching closer without drawing attention, but the distance was still too great for him to catch more than a few scattered words. He needed to be closer. His opportunity came when Sarah's phone rang, startling her slightly. She answered it quickly, apologizing to Lauren as she stepped away to take the call. As Sarah moved out of earshot, Lauren remained seated on the bench, flipping through the papers Sarah had left behind. James saw his chance. He moved carefully, circling around the bench to a position where he could pretend to be rummaging through a nearby trash bin. From there, he could hear Lauren's voice, low and deliberate as she read through the documents. "We can't afford to let this get out," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "If anyone finds out about the funding, it's all over." James's heart skipped a beat. Funding? For what? He listened intently, his pulse quickening as he realized that there was indeed something more to these women than their outward appearance suggested. He had assumed there might be secrets, but he hadn't expected to uncover anything so quickly. Lauren glanced around, seemingly satisfied that no one was paying attention to her. She made a note on the top sheet, then closed the file, her expression unreadable. Whatever it was, she was clearly determined to keep it hidden. As Sarah returned, Lauren's demeanor shifted instantly, the tension melting away as she handed the papers back with a smile. They exchanged a few more words, something about a meeting later that week, before parting ways. Lauren left first, striding out of the park with the same confident grace she had arrived with. James waited until Sarah had gathered her things and left before he moved. He needed time to process what he had overheard. There was more at play here than he had anticipated, and if he was going to find out the truth, he would need to dig deeper. But as he watched Sarah walk away, a thought nagged at the back of his mind. This wasn't just about uncovering secrets anymore. The more he learned about these women, the more personal it became. He wasn't just testing their integrity, he was starting to question his own. The lines between his role as an observer and his emerging feelings for these women were beginning to blur, and James knew he was on dangerous ground. He turned to leave the park, his thoughts swirling with the new information. Whatever Sarah and Lauren were involved in, it was something that could ruin them if exposed. And now, he was in the perfect position to find out exactly what that was. But at what cost? James spent the next few days piecing together what little information he had about Sarah and Lauren. His instincts, honed by years of legal practice, told him there was something significant beneath the surface, something that connected these two women in a way that went beyond mere friendship or casual philanthropy. He needed more than just snippets of overheard conversations and fleeting observations. He needed real, concrete information. He started by shadowing them discreetly, watching where they went, whom they met, and how they interacted with the world around them. He followed Lauren first, drawn by the air of authority she carried. Despite her apparent involvement in something questionable, Lauren moved through her day with the confidence of someone who was used to getting what she wanted. James observed her as she attended a series of meetings across the city. One was at a sleek, modern office building in Midtown, where she spent over an hour behind closed doors with a group of serious-looking men in expensive suits. Another was at a more inconspicuous location, a small, unmarked office in a quieter part of town. James couldn't help but notice the contrast between the two meetings. The first was all about appearances, while the second had the feel of something more covert. He managed to slip into the building after Lauren left, feigning interest in a flyer posted near the entrance while keeping an eye on the door she had exited. A quick scan of the building directory revealed nothing unusual, just a list of generic business names. He jotted down the room number and resolved to investigate later, knowing that it could be the key to understanding what Lauren was involved in. Sarah, on the other hand, was more difficult to pin down. Her days seemed to revolve around community work, visiting shelters, organizing charity events, and spending time with children at local schools. She was the image of selflessness, but James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story as well. One afternoon, he followed her to a youth center in Harlem, where she was leading a workshop for at-risk teens. He watched from a distance as she engaged with the kids, her demeanor warm and approachable. They clearly respected her, looking up to her in a way that suggested she was more than just a passing influence in their lives. As the workshop ended and the kids began to leave, Sarah stayed behind, speaking quietly with one of the counselors. James couldn't hear their conversation, but the tension in their body language was clear. The counselor, a tall man with a stern expression, seemed to be pleading with her about something. while Sarah shook her head, her face set in a look of determination. James's curiosity flared. He moved closer, positioning himself near the open window to catch snippets of their conversation. "Not safe, Sarah," the man was saying, his voice low but urgent. "You're putting yourself at risk. They're not going to stop just because you're doing good work." Sarah's response was too quiet to hear, but the man's reaction was unmistakable. He grabbed her arm, not in anger, but in desperation. "Please, just consider it. You've done more than enough. Let someone else take the heat for a while." She pulled her arm away gently but firmly, offering him a small, sad smile before picking up her bag and walking out. The man stood there for a moment, shoulders slumped in defeat, before turning off the lights and locking the door behind him. James didn't know what to make of it. What kind of danger was Sarah involved in? And why was she so determined to continue, despite the risks? He followed her as she left the center, his mind racing with possibilities. Whatever it was clear that Sarah was deeply committed. So much so that she was willing to put herself in harm's way. It only made him more determined to uncover the truth. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city, James found himself drawn back to that unmarked office Lauren had visited earlier in the week. He needed to get inside, to see what she had been so secretive about. The building was nearly deserted by the time he arrived, the fading light providing just enough cover for him to slip inside unnoticed. He found the door to the office slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. Cautiously, he pushed it open, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was small, cluttered with file cabinets and stacks of paper. A single desk lamp cast a dim glow over the space, revealing a haphazard array of documents spread out on the desk. James's eyes were immediately drawn to a folder labeled with a familiar name, Sarah's. He hesitated for only a moment before reaching for it, his fingers trembling slightly. Inside, he found detailed reports, photographs, and notes that painted a picture far more complex than he had imagined. There were financial records showing large sums of money being funneled into various accounts, some of which were linked to offshore banks. There were also surveillance photos of Sarah at different locations around the city, including some of the same places he had followed her to. As he sifted through the documents, the pieces began to fall into place. Sarah and Lauren were involved in something big, something that extended far beyond charity work or community outreach. They were part of a network, possibly even a front for something illegal. And Lauren's earlier words about the funding suddenly made sense. Whatever they were doing, it was dangerous, and they were being watched. James's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. If he had found these documents so easily, then others could too. Sarah and Lauren were walking a tightrope, and one wrong move could bring everything crashing down. He needed to confront them, to find out exactly what was going on. But as he stood there in that dimly lit office, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy he didn't fully understand, James felt the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. He had started this journey out of a desire to test the integrity of those around him, but now he was in too deep. The truth was out there, just within his reach. But the closer he got, the more he realized that finding it might come at a price he wasn't prepared to pay. As he left the office, slipping back into the night, James knew that the next steps he took would be critical. Whatever Sarah and Lauren were involved in, it was bigger than he had anticipated. And now, it was only a matter of time before he would have to choose: expose their secrets or become complicit in them. James couldn't shake the unease that settled over him after leaving the unmarked office. The folder he had discovered left him with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Sarah and Lauren were involved in something that went far beyond mere charity work. The evidence he'd uncovered hinted at a network of activities that skirted the edges of legality, with financial transactions and surveillance records that could spell disaster if they fell into the wrong hands. He spent the next few days wrestling with his conscience, torn between the need to uncover the full truth and the growing realization that he might be crossing a line he couldn't return from. The more he learned, the more personal it became. It wasn't just about testing the integrity of those around him anymore. It was about understanding what kind of person he truly was. James decided that the only way forward was to confront Sarah and Lauren directly. But he knew he couldn't do it as the man he had been pretending to be. If he wanted the truth, He would have to reveal parts of his own story as well. The thought unsettled him, but he pushed it aside. He needed answers. He started with Lauren. Tracking her was easy. Her routine was predictable in its own way. He knew she would be at her regular lunch spot, a small, upscale bistro tucked away on a quiet street. It was the kind of place where deals were made over glasses of fine wine, where secrets were shared in hushed tones. James arrived early, positioning himself at a table near the back, where he could watch the entrance. His heart raced as he waited, the minutes ticking by with agonizing slowness. When Lauren finally walked in, her entrance was as poised and confident as always. She was alone, dressed impeccably in a dark blazer and heels, her expression giving away nothing as she scanned the room before making her way to a reserved table. James hesitated only for a moment before standing and approaching her. He noticed her tense slightly as he neared, a flicker of recognition in her eyes as she realized who he was, or at least who she thought he was. "Lauren," he said, his voice low but steady. "I think we need to talk." She glanced around, making sure they were not being overheard, before nodding slowly. "You've been following me, haven't you?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with suspicion. James didn't deny it. "I have," he admitted, "but I'm not here to threaten you or expose anything. At least, not yet. I just want to understand what's going on." Lauren studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she weighed her options. Finally, she motioned for him to sit. "You're more than you appear to be, aren't you?" she said quietly, her gaze piercing. "Who are you really, and why are you doing this?" James took a deep breath, deciding that the time for deception had passed. "My name is James Anderson. I'm not who I've been pretending to be. I'm a lawyer, or I was, until I decided to step away from it all. I wanted to see the world from a different perspective, to test the integrity of those around me." Lauren's expression didn't change, but he could see the gears turning in her mind. "So you chose to play this game with us? To see if we were trustworthy?" "It started that way," James admitted, his voice dropping. "But now, I'm not so sure anymore. I've seen things that don't add up, things that make me question everything I thought I knew about you and Sarah." Lauren's eyes darkened at the mention of Sarah's name. "What have you seen?" she asked, her tone more guarded now. James hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I found documents, financial records, and surveillance photos. They all point to something bigger, something dangerous. I need to know what you're involved in, Lauren, and I need to know why." For a moment, Lauren said nothing. Her gaze locked on his, as if she were trying to decide whether to trust him. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxing slightly, though her eyes remained sharp. "It's not what you think," she said quietly, "but it's complicated, and if you're not careful, it could get both of us into a lot of trouble." "Then explain it to me," James pressed. "I'm already in this far. If there's a way to help, I need to know." Lauren sighed, rubbing her temples as if the weight of her decisions was finally catching up to her. "You're right, there is something going on, but it's not some grand conspiracy or illegal operation, at least not in the way you're thinking. Sarah and we're trying to expose corruption within a major charity organization. The people running it are laundering money through their donations, funneling it into offshore accounts. They're stealing from the very people they claim to be helping." James's mind raced as he processed her words. "So you're undercover? Both of you?" "More or less," Lauren replied, her voice tinged with bitterness. "We've been gathering evidence for months, but it's been slow. We have to be careful. These people are powerful, and they have connections in high places. One wrong move, and they'll bury us before we can bring anything to light." James felt a surge of mixed emotions. Relief that they weren't the criminals he had feared, but also dread at the danger they were in. "Does Sarah know I've been following you?" "She suspects," Lauren said, her eyes flickering with something like concern. "She's always been more intuitive than me, more trusting. But if you've uncovered what you say you have, then we're all in more danger than we realized." James leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "What's the plan? How do you intend to take them down?" Lauren looked at him, a hint of desperation creeping into her expression. "We're running out of time. We were planning to meet with a whistleblower, someone inside the organization who's willing to testify, but he's gone silent. We think they might have found out about him." James's heart sank. "And if they have? Then we're next," Lauren said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've tried to stay under the radar, but it's only a matter of time before they start looking for us." James knew he was at a crossroads. He had the power to walk away, to let them handle the situation on their own. But he also knew that if he did, the weight of their potential downfall would rest heavily on his conscience. He had started this journey to test the integrity of others, but now it was his own that was on the line. "I can help," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "But we need to be smart about this. If they're as powerful as you say, we can't go in blindly." Lauren studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deceit. Finding none, she nodded. "Then you need to talk to Sarah. She'll have more details. But we can't meet like this again. It's too risky. I'll arrange a meeting somewhere safe." James nodded, feeling the gravity of what he was getting himself into. As Lauren rose to leave, she paused, turning back to him with a look that was both grateful and wary. "Thank you, James," she said quietly. "But remember, once you're in, there's no going back." He watched her leave, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. The truth he had been seeking was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And now, he was about to dive even deeper into a world where trust was as fragile as a house of cards. James waited anxiously in the dimly lit cafe, the soft hum of conversation around him doing little to calm his nerves. Lauren had set up the meeting with Sarah, and he knew this was the moment where everything could change. He would finally confront Sarah, lay everything on the table, and see if there was a way out of the tangled web they had all found themselves in. The cafe was tucked away on a quiet street, chosen for its anonymity and the privacy it offered. James had arrived early, choosing a booth in the back corner where he could watch the entrance without being easily seen. He ordered a coffee, more to have something to do with his hands than out of any real desire for it, and waited. When Sarah walked in, James felt a jolt of apprehension. She looked different outside the formalities of charity events and community work, more guarded, as if she knew this meeting was about more than just pleasantries. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, and when she spotted James, a flicker of recognition crossed her face, followed by a hint of wariness. She approached the table with measured steps, her expression neutral. As she slid into the booth opposite him, James noticed the slight tension in her posture, the way she kept her back straight and her eyes fixed on his, ready for whatever was coming next. "James," she said, her voice calm but with an edge of uncertainty. "Or should I call you something else?" "James is fine," he replied, trying to keep his tone steady. "I know you must have a lot of questions." "I do too." Sarah nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "Lauren told me some of what's going on. I've been wondering why you were so interested in us, but I didn't expect this." James took a deep breath, deciding it was time to be completely honest. "I'm not proud of how this started. I wanted to see the world from a different perspective, to test the integrity of the people I interacted with. But what I found with you and Lauren, it's so much more than I bargained for." Sarah's expression softened slightly, but the guardedness remained. "So what now, James? You followed us, dug into our lives. What is it you want?" "I want to help," James said, his voice earnest. "Lauren explained what you're doing, trying to expose the corruption within that charity. I know I've crossed lines, but I want to make this right. You're in danger, and if you're going to take these people down, you're going to need all the help you can get." Sarah studied him, her eyes searching his for any sign of deceit. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded, a slight sigh escaping her lips. "We didn't want to involve anyone else, especially not someone we didn't know we could trust. But Lauren seems to think you're sincere, and I trust her judgment." James felt a flicker of relief, but knew this was just the beginning. "I've seen the files, Sarah. The surveillance photos, the financial records. This goes deep, and the people you're up against aren't going to back down easily. What's the next step?" Sarah glanced around the cafe, as if making sure no one was listening, then leaned in closer. "We were supposed to meet with a whistleblower, a man on the inside who was ready to testify against them. He had access to everything, from bank records to communications that could prove the money laundering. But he's gone dark. We think they might have gotten to him." James frowned. The implication's clear. If they've silenced him, then they know you're onto them. You're not just playing with fire anymore. You're in the middle of it. "I know," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with frustration, "but we can't stop now. If we back off, they'll just cover their tracks and move on. We have to find him, or at least get our hands on the evidence he was going to give us." James considered their options, his mind racing. "What do you know about him? Where he might be?" "Not much," Sarah admitted. "He was cautious, never gave us his real name or location. We communicated through encrypted channels, but the last message he sent was a warning, something about being followed. After that, nothing." James leaned back, his thoughts churning. He might still be out there, hiding, but if they're looking for him, we need to find him first. "Do you have access to the communication logs? Anything that might give us a clue?" Sarah nodded. "I have everything, but it's all back at my place. I didn't want to risk bringing it here." James understood the caution. "Then we need to move quickly. If we can track him down, maybe we can still salvage this. But we have to assume they're watching you too. We need to be careful." Sarah hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table for a moment before she looked back up at him. "Why are you really doing this, James? Is it just guilt for getting involved, or is there more?" James felt a knot form in his stomach, the question cutting deeper than he expected. He had started this whole charade to test others, but now he was the one being tested. He didn't have a simple answer, and that scared him more than anything. "I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's a need to prove to myself that I'm not as lost as I feel. But I do know this. I can't walk away now. Not when I see what's at stake." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "All right, James. Let's go get those logs. And after that, we'll figure out our next move." They left the cafe together, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them both. As they walked through the city streets, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that every step they took was leading them deeper into a trap they might not escape from. But he also knew that turning back was no longer an option. He was in this now, and whatever came next, he would face it head on. For better or worse, he was part of this fight, and there was no going back. Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news. The chill in the evening air seemed to seep into James's bones as he and Sarah walked briskly through the streets of New York. The city's familiar hustle and bustle continued around them, oblivious to the storm brewing in their lives. As they approached Sarah's apartment building, a nondescript structure nestled between two much larger ones, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into a trap. Every instinct screamed at him to be cautious. Sarah's apartment was on the third floor, accessible only by a narrow, dimly lit stairwell. As they ascended, James found himself listening for any unusual sounds, his nerves on high alert. Sarah, too, was tense, her usual calm demeanor now replaced by a sense of urgency. Once inside the apartment, Sarah wasted no time. She led James to a small study at the back of the apartment, where a cluttered desk was covered in papers, a laptop, and a few scattered USB drives. The room was modest, with bookshelves lining the walls, filled with everything from legal texts to novels. It was the kind of place that spoke to Sarah's meticulous nature, a mix of order and chaos, with a purpose behind every detail. "This is it," Sarah said, gesturing to the laptop and the stacks of documents. "Everything we've been working on is here. The communication logs, financial records, even some preliminary reports we were drafting. The whistleblower we were working with sent us most of this information, but there's more that we haven't been able to decode yet." James sat down at the desk, the gravity of the situation settling in. "Do you have any idea where he might have gone? If they're after him, he might be hiding or trying to contact you through other means." Sarah shook her head, frustration evident in her eyes. "No, nothing. We've tried reaching out through every channel we have, but it's like he's vanished. And without his testimony or the rest of the data he was supposed to provide, our case is weak." James nodded, his mind racing as he booted up the laptop. "Let's start with what we have. Maybe there's something here that can point us in the right direction." Sarah hovered nearby as James began sifting through the files, her anxiety palpable. The logs showed a series of encrypted messages exchanged between Sarah and the whistleblower, each one carefully worded to avoid giving away too much. The last few messages were the most concerning. Hints of a tale, vague references to being compromised, and then nothing. Just silence. "This doesn't look good," James muttered, scrolling through the messages. If they found him, they might have gotten to him before he could send the rest of the data. "We need to figure out where he was when he sent these last messages." Sarah pulled up a map on her phone, showing the locations of their previous meetings with the whistleblower. "We always met in public places, cafes, libraries, places where we could blend in, but he never stayed in one spot for too long. He was careful, always paranoid about being watched." James studied the map, his eyes tracing the routes. He was right to be paranoid, but maybe there's a pattern here. If we can figure out his movements, we might be able to find his last location. They spent the next hour cross-referencing the locations with the timestamps on the messages, trying to pinpoint where the whistleblower might have been when he sent his last communication. It was a painstaking process, made more difficult by the lack of solid information. But finally, something caught James's eye. "Here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map. "This area. He used it twice in the last week. It's close to a major subway station, lots of foot traffic, but also a few abandoned buildings nearby. If he was trying to lay low, this would be a good place to disappear." Sarah leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she considered the location. "It's risky, but it makes sense. If he was being followed, he could have ducked into one of those buildings to shake his tail." James nodded, already thinking ahead. "We should check it out. If he left anything behind, it could be our only lead." But as they prepared to leave, Sarah's phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at it, her expression darkening as she read the message. "It's Lauren. She's been getting calls from an unknown number, someone claiming they have information for us, but they won't say who they are or what it's about." James frowned, a sense of unease creeping over him. It could be a trap. If they know you're onto them, they might be trying to lure you out. Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with worry. "I thought the same thing. But if there's even a chance it's our whistleblower, we have to check it out." James felt the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Every move they made from here on out had to be carefully calculated. One wrong step, and they could lose everything. "We'll go together. We'll be careful, and if anything feels off, we pull back." "Agreed?" "Agreed," Sarah said, her voice firm, "but we can't wait too long. If this is him, we need to act fast." They gathered what they needed, slipping back out into the night. The city felt different now, the familiar streets taking on a more sinister edge. As they made their way to the location, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something they weren't fully prepared for. The area was as James had expected, dimly lit, with the sounds of the city muted by the towering buildings around them. The subway station nearby was bustling with late-night commuters, but the street they found themselves on was almost eerily quiet. "This is it," Sarah whispered, her breath visible in the cold night air. "One of these buildings could be where he's hiding. But we have to be quick. If anyone's watching, we don't want to give them time to react." James nodded, scanning the area. The buildings were mostly boarded up, remnants of an older New York that had been left behind as the city grew around it. But one building, in particular, stood out, a small, two-story structure with a single light flickering in one of the upstairs windows. "That's our best bet," James said, his voice low. "Let's check it out." They moved cautiously, staying close to the shadows as they approached the building. The front door was ajar, creaking softly as James pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of dust and decay. The first floor was empty, nothing but old furniture and debris scattered across the floor. "This way," Sarah whispered, pointing to a staircase at the back of the room. The steps groaned under their weight as they ascended, the creaking was sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. When they reached the second floor, James paused, listening for any signs of life. The flickering light they had seen from outside was coming from a room at the end of the hall, the door partially open. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded silently, her expression tense. They approached the door slowly, each step feeling like it took an eternity. James's hand tightened around the doorknob, his pulse quickening as he pushed the door open. The room was small, dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Papers were strewn across a table in the center of the room, along with an old laptop that hummed softly. But the room's occupant was what caught their attention. A man, slumped over in a chair, his head resting on the table. Sarah gasped, rushing forward. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and fear. "But he's unconscious." James moved quickly, checking the man's pulse. It was weak, but he was alive. "We need to get him out of here," James said, already thinking ahead. "But first, we need to see what he was working on. If there's any information here that can help us, we need to take it." Sarah nodded, tears glistening in her eyes as she looked at the man who had risked everything to expose the truth. She began gathering the papers while James searched the laptop, hoping to find the missing pieces to the puzzle. But as they worked, a sudden noise from downstairs froze them in place. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing up the stairs. Someone was coming. James and Sarah exchanged a glance, the gravity of the situation hitting them both at once. They were out of time. "We need to move now," James hissed, grabbing the man by the shoulders and lifting him to his feet. He was barely conscious, but James managed to get him upright, with Sarah supporting him from the other side. They moved as quickly and quietly as they could, slipping out of the room and back down the hallway. But as they reached the top of the stairs, the footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever was coming wasn't far behind. James scanned the hallway, his mind racing. "There," he whispered, pointing to a small window at the end of the corridor. "It's our only way out." Sarah's eyes widened, but she nodded, helping James guide the man toward the window. James pushed it open, the cold night air rushing in as he looked down. It was a drop of about 10 feet, not ideal, but survivable. "I'll go first," James said, helping the man to the edge of the window. "Then I'll help you get him down." Sarah didn't hesitate, her trust in James evident. She braced herself against the wall as James climbed out, dropping down to the ground below with a grunt as he landed. He looked up, motioning for Sarah to lower the man down. It took all of James's strength to catch him, but he managed, easing the man to the ground as Sarah climbed out after him. They moved quickly, slipping into the shadows just as the footsteps reached the room above. James glanced back, watching as the light in the upstairs window was extinguished, replaced by the ominous glow of flashlights. Whoever was up there was searching for them. "Come on," James urged, his voice low. "We need to get out of here." They moved as fast as they could, disappearing into the maze of alleyways that crisscrossed the neighborhood. The man between them was weak, barely able to keep up, but they didn't stop. Not until they were far enough away that the sounds of the city swallowed up any trace of their pursuers. As they finally slowed down, James turned to Sarah, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to find a place to lay low, somewhere they won't find us." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I know a place," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "But we need to move fast. If they know we have him, they'll stop at nothing to find us." James didn't need to be told twice. They were in deeper than ever now, and the stakes had never been higher. As they helped the man along, his consciousness fading in and out, James knew that the next few hours could determine everything. Whether they would succeed in their mission, or whether they would be silenced forever. The night air bit into James's skin as they hurried through the labyrinth of alleyways, their breath visible in the cold. Sarah led the way, her grip firm around the man's waist as they half-carried, half-dragged him through the darkened streets. The man's weight sagged between them, his feet barely touching the ground as his consciousness flickered in and out. They couldn't afford to stop, not even for a moment, with the threat of pursuit hanging over them like a shadow. "We're almost there," Sarah whispered, though it sounded more like a reassurance to herself than to James. Her face was set in grim determination, every step fueled by the need to keep moving, to stay one step ahead of whoever was chasing them. James could feel his own exhaustion setting in, but he pushed it aside. They had no choice but to keep going. His mind raced, thinking of the man they had just pulled from the brink of death. If he had been caught up in this conspiracy, whatever information he held must be crucial. The documents they had managed to grab back at the building were crammed into his coat pocket, but without the man's testimony, they might not be enough. Finally, after what felt like hours, they emerged onto a quiet street on the edge of the city. The buildings here were older, their facades weathered and crumbling. The area was deserted, with only the occasional flicker of a distant streetlight casting faint pools of light across the cracked sidewalks. Sarah led them to a small, nondescript building at the end of the block. It looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof, but as they approached the door, Sarah produced a key from her pocket. She unlocked the door with trembling hands, casting a nervous glance over her shoulder as she pushed it open. "Inside," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. James didn't hesitate, helping the man inside before slipping in after him. Sarah followed, closing the door quietly behind them and locking it again. The interior was as dilapidated as the exterior. A single room with peeling wallpaper, dusty furniture, and a few scattered belongings that hinted at occasional use. "This place belonged to a friend," Sarah explained, her voice hushed. "She used to stay here when she was in between jobs, but it's been empty for a while. No one knows about it, so we should be safe for now." James nodded, grateful for the sanctuary, no matter how temporary it might be. They carefully lowered the unconscious man onto a battered sofa, propping him up with a few cushions. His breathing was shallow, and his face was pale, but he was alive. "What do we do now?" James asked, his voice thick with fatigue. He leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. The adrenaline that had carried him this far was starting to fade, leaving behind the stark reality of their situation. Sarah ran a hand through her hair, her fingers trembling slightly. "First, we need to get him stable. I have some supplies here, medical stuff, food, water. After that, we'll go through the documents we found and see if there's anything we can use. We have to figure out what he was trying to tell us before he went off the grid." She moved quickly, rummaging through a small cabinet in the corner of the room. James watched her, feeling a deep respect for her resilience. Despite everything they'd been through, Sarah was holding it together, focused on the task at hand. He knew that she was scared. He could see it in the way her hands shook, the tightness around her eyes, but she was determined not to let it control her. As Sarah began tending to the man, James pulled out the papers they had grabbed from the building and spread them out on the floor. The documents were a jumbled mess of financial records, emails, and notes. But one thing was clear. They pointed to a sophisticated money laundering operation. The charity Sarah and Lauren had been investigating was a front, siphoning off millions of dollars into offshore accounts while masquerading as a legitimate organization. "This is bigger than I thought," James murmured, scanning the pages. "They've been doing this for years, moving money through shell companies and fake donations. But there's something else here, something they're hiding." Sarah glanced over at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" James held up a document that had been partially torn, the edges frayed. Look at the dates. This transaction was made just a few days ago, after your whistleblower disappeared. They're moving money faster now, like they're trying to cover their tracks. Whatever's happening, it's escalating." Sarah's face tightened with worry. "We need to get this to Lauren. She can analyze it further, find out where the money's going." James nodded, but a sense of dread weighed heavily on him. "If they know we have this information, they won't stop until they find us. We have to be prepared for that." "I know," Sarah said softly, her voice laced with fear. "But we can't stop now. If we back off, they'll win, and everything we've done will be for nothing." As she finished tending to the man, Sarah turned to face James fully, her eyes burning with resolve. "We'll stay here for the night, then get this information to Lauren in the morning. After that, we'll decide our next move." James agreed, though sleep seemed like an impossible luxury at that moment. As they settled in for the night, the reality of their situation hung over them like a storm cloud, ready to break at any moment. The minutes ticked by in silence, each one heavier than the last. James sat by the window, keeping watch as the city outside remained eerily quiet. The man on the sofa stirred occasionally, his breathing deepening as he slowly began to regain consciousness. Just before dawn, as the first light of day began to creep through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, James heard the man murmur something unintelligible. He leaned in closer, trying to catch the words. "Files hidden," the man whispered, his voice hoarse. "In the basement of the charity headquarters." James's heart skipped a beat. He glanced at Sarah, who had also heard the words, her eyes wide with realization. "If he's right," Sarah whispered, "then the last piece of evidence we need is still out there. But it's inside the lion's den." James nodded, his mind already racing with the implications. The truth they had been searching for was within reach, but to get it, they would have to walk straight into the heart of danger. There was no turning back now. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the empty streets, as James and Sarah prepared to leave the safety of the hideout. The man they had rescued was still unconscious, his warning about the hidden files replaying in James's mind. If those files were indeed in the basement of the charity's headquarters, then they held the key to exposing the entire operation. But getting to them would be the most dangerous move they had made yet. Sarah checked her phone one last time before slipping it into her pocket. She had sent a message to Lauren, brief and encrypted, alerting her to their plan. "Lauren's going to meet us nearby," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "She'll have a car ready for a quick getaway, and she's bringing someone she trusts to help us get inside." James nodded, appreciating the plan but aware of its risks. "This is going to be a tight operation," he said, his tone serious. "We go in, get the files, and get out fast. If they catch us in there," Sarah finished his sentence, her voice filled with resolve, "then we don't let them. We have to get those files, James. It's our only shot." They left the hideout as the morning light began to creep over the city, casting a cold glow over the deserted streets. The world around them was just waking up, unaware of the high-stakes game being played in its shadows. The charity's headquarters, a modern, nondescript building in the heart of the city, was only a few blocks away. As they approached, James felt the tension in his chest tighten. This was it, the moment where everything could go wrong. Lauren was waiting for them a block away from the building, parked in an inconspicuous black sedan. She stepped out as they approached, her expression grim. "I've got everything we need," she said, holding up a small black duffel bag. "Tools, a burner phone, and a laptop for extracting the data. This is a one-shot deal, so we can't afford any mistakes." James took a deep breath, appreciating the gravity of the situation. Lauren was right. There would be no second chances. "Who's helping us get in?" he asked, scanning the area for any sign of their mysterious ally. Lauren motioned toward the sedan, where a figure stepped out from the passenger side. It was a man, tall and muscular, with close-cropped hair and a serious expression. He wore dark clothing that blended easily into the early morning shadows. "This is Marcus," Lauren introduced, her tone clipped. "He's ex-military, specializes in covert operations. If anyone can get us in and out without being detected, it's him." Marcus gave a curt nod, his eyes assessing James and Sarah with a professional detachment. "I've scouted the building," he said, his voice low and even. "The security is tight, but there's a blind spot on the west side near the service entrance. That's our way in. Once we're inside, we need to move fast. The longer we're in there, the greater the risk." James and Sarah exchanged a glance, both recognizing the stakes. There was no time for second-guessing or hesitation. This was the moment where they would either succeed or lose everything. "Let's do it," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now." Marcus led the way, keeping to the shadows as they approached the building. The streets were still mostly empty, the city not yet fully awake, which worked to their advantage. They moved quickly, crossing the distance in minutes until they reached the west side of the building. The service entrance was tucked away behind a row of dumpsters, partially obscured from view. Marcus motioned for them to stay back as he approached the door, his movements precise and controlled. He pulled out a small device from the duffel bag, attaching it to the electronic keypad next to the door. A few seconds later, there was a soft click, and the door swung open. "Go," Marcus whispered, holding the door for them. James felt his pulse quicken as they slipped inside, the cold, sterile air of the building washing over them. The hallway was dimly lit, with the faint hum of the building's systems providing the only sound. They moved in silence, following Marcus as he led them deeper into the building. The charity's headquarters was deceptively simple, a modern, sleek design with clean lines and minimalist decor. But James knew that behind its polished exterior, something far more sinister was at work. As they passed closed doors and empty offices, he couldn't help but wonder how many people working here were aware of the corruption happening right under their noses. They reached the elevator at the end of the hall, and Marcus pressed the call button. The doors opened almost immediately, and they stepped inside. Marcus hit the button for the basement, and the doors slid shut with a soft whoosh. The ride down was agonizingly slow, the tension in the small space palpable. Sarah's hand brushed against James's, a small, reassuring gesture that helped ground him in the moment. He glanced at her, seeing the same determination mirrored in her eyes. They were in this together, and no matter what happened next, they would face it side by side. The elevator doors opened to a dimly lit corridor, the air cool and stale. The basement was quieter, the hum of the building's systems more pronounced here. Marcus led the way, his steps silent on the concrete floor. They moved quickly, scanning each door they passed, until they reached the one marked simply as records. "This is it," Marcus said, pulling a small tool from the duffel bag. He worked quickly on the lock, and within seconds, the door clicked open. They slipped inside, the room dark except for the faint glow of a security light in the corner. James could make out rows of filing cabinets and shelves, all filled with documents and data storage devices. This was the heart of the operation, where the most sensitive information was kept. Lauren pulled out the laptop, setting it up on a nearby table as James and Sarah began searching the room. They worked methodically, pulling open drawers and scanning files for anything that could be the missing piece they needed. "Over here," Sarah whispered urgently, holding up a thick file. "This has dates, transactions. This is what we're looking for." James took the file from her, flipping through the pages quickly. It was all there. Bank transfers, names of shell companies, even the offshore accounts where the money was being funneled. This was the evidence they needed to bring the entire operation down. "Copy everything," James said, handing the file to Lauren. "We need to get out of here before they realize we're in." Lauren nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she copied the data. Marcus stood by the door, his eyes and ears alert for any sign of trouble. As the last of the files were copied, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. James's heart leaped into his throat as Marcus motioned for them to be silent. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the door. As the car sped away from the charity's headquarters, James stared out the window, the city blurring into a wash of early morning light. His mind raced with the events of the last hour, the tension, the near miss in the records room, and the files now securely hidden in the laptop bag at his feet. They had what they needed to bring the operation down, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on him. In the front seat, Marcus drove with the same focused intensity he had shown throughout the mission, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Lauren sat beside him, her laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard as she began decrypting the files they had just stolen. The car was filled with a tense silence, each of them lost in their thoughts. Sarah, sitting beside James in the back seat, finally broke the silence. "What's our next move?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. Lauren glanced back at her, the glow from the laptop screen highlighting the determination in her eyes. "I'm going through the files now. Once I've decrypted everything, we'll have enough evidence to go public. But we need to be smart about this. If we release it too soon, they might have time to cover their tracks." James nodded, his thoughts already turning to the logistics. "We need to find a secure location where we can analyze everything without being traced. If they realize we've got the files, they'll come after us hard. We can't afford any mistakes." Marcus spoke up, his voice calm and authoritative. "There's a safe house outside the city. It's off the grid, no electronics that can be traced. We can regroup there, figure out our next steps, and plan how to release the information." The plan made sense, but James couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing a dangerous game, one where every move could be their last. The people they were up against wouldn't hesitate to silence them if they felt threatened, and now that they had the proof, the stakes were higher than ever. They drove for what felt like hours, the city slowly giving way to the outskirts, where the roads were less traveled and the landscape more desolate. Marcus navigated the twists and turns with practiced ease, eventually pulling off the main road and onto a dirt path that wound through a dense forest. The safe house was well hidden, a small cabin nestled among the trees, invisible from the road. As they pulled up, Marcus killed the engine, and they all sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they were about to do settling over them. "This is it," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "We'll be safe here for now, but we need to move quickly. The sooner we get this information out, the better." They exited the car, the cold morning air biting at their faces as they hurried inside. The cabin was simple, with a small living area, a kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. It was sparsely furnished, but it had everything they needed: privacy, security, and a place to plan their next move. Lauren set up her laptop on the kitchen table, immediately diving back into the files. James and Sarah hovered nearby, their eyes scanning the screen as line after line of data flashed by. The information was damning: bank records, internal communications, and transaction logs that painted a clear picture of the corruption at the heart of the charity. "This is more than enough," Lauren said, her voice filled with a mixture of triumph and fear. "If we release this, it'll take them down. But we need to be strategic about it. We have to hit them in a way that they can't recover from." James nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. "We could leak it to the press, but we'll need to make sure it reaches multiple outlets at once. If one goes down, the others can still run the story." "Agreed," Sarah added. "We should also reach out to law enforcement, but only after the story breaks. That way, there's public pressure on them to act. If we go to them first, they might try to suppress it." Marcus, who had been quietly standing guard near the door, finally spoke up. "And what about us? Once this goes live, they'll come after us. We need a plan to get out, to disappear if things go south." The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation hit them all. This was the moment where their lives would change forever. Whether they succeeded or failed, nothing would ever be the same. "We'll need new identities, safe houses in different locations," Lauren said, already thinking ahead. "I can reach out to some contacts, people who owe me favors. But once we do this, we can't look back. We'll be fugitives." James felt the weight of her words, the reality of what they were about to undertake pressing down on him. But he knew there was no turning back now. They had come too far, uncovered too much. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. "Let's do it," he said finally, his voice steady. "We'll leak the files, make sure the story spreads, and then we disappear. It's the only way." Lauren nodded, her fingers resuming their work on the laptop. "I'll set up the encrypted channels for the leak. Once I hit send, it'll be out of our hands." The tension in the room was palpable as they finalized their plans. Each of them knew the risks, but they also knew that this was their only chance to bring down the operation. They were David against Goliath, armed with nothing but the truth. As Lauren prepared the files for release, James glanced out the window, the sun now fully risen above the horizon. The world outside was calm, peaceful even, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within the cabin. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. They were about to step into the unknown, with no guarantee of success, no assurance that they would even survive the fallout. But they had come together for this moment, driven by a shared purpose. "Are you ready?" Lauren asked, her voice cutting through the silence. James turned back to the group, meeting each of their gazes. "Let's finish this." With a final nod, Lauren hit the send button. The files began to upload, the progress bar inching forward as the truth they had fought so hard to uncover was finally set free. There was no turning back now. The last chess move had been made, and all they could do was wait for the pieces to fall. For a long, agonizing moment, they waited, barely breathing. Then, the footsteps continued down the hall, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Marcus turned back to them, his expression serious. "We're done here. Let's move." They quickly packed up the equipment, securing the files and shutting down the laptop. Marcus led the way out of the room, his movements quick and precise as they retraced their steps back to the service entrance. As they stepped out into the cold morning air, the sun just beginning to rise over the city, James felt a rush of relief. They had done it. They had the evidence they needed to expose the truth. But as they hurried toward the waiting car, James knew this was far from over. The real fight was just beginning. As the files uploaded, time seemed to stretch infinitely, every second marked by the slow advance of the progress bar on Lauren's laptop. The cabin was cloaked in a heavy silence, broken only by the soft hum of the computer and the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath their feet. James could feel the tension in the room, a tangible thing pressing down on them as they waited for the final moment when their truth would be unleashed on the world. Finally, with a soft chime, the upload completed. The files were gone, sent to dozens of journalists, news outlets, and advocacy groups. In a matter of minutes, the story would begin to break. Headlines and breaking news alerts flashing across screens, emails flooding inboxes, social media erupting with the shocking revelations. The full scope of the charity's corruption, exposed for all to see. "It's done," Lauren said quietly, her fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment longer before she closed the laptop. She looked up at the others, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "There's no going back now. We've lit the fuse." James felt a surge of emotions, relief, anxiety, fear, all colliding within him. They had done it. After everything they had been through, they had finally exposed the truth. But with that truth now out in the open, they were no longer just whistleblowers. They were targets. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but underlined with tension. She was standing by the window, peering out at the dense forest that surrounded the cabin, as if expecting danger to emerge from the trees at any moment. "We wait," Marcus said, his tone calm and measured. "They'll realize soon enough that the information is out there. When they do, they'll come after us with everything they've got. We need to be ready to move." Lauren nodded, already packing up her laptop and gathering their things. "We need to split up," she said. "If we stay together, we're easier to track. Marcus and I can take one route, and James, you and Sarah can take another. We'll regroup once we're sure we're not being followed." James agreed, though the thought of splitting up made him uneasy. "We'll need to stay off the grid. No phones, no credit cards. We have to disappear completely." Sarah turned away from the window, a determined look on her face. "We knew this was coming. We'll be careful." Lauren handed James a small burner phone, preloaded with only the most basic functions and a single contact, Lauren's. "Use this if you need to reach us," she said, "but only if it's an emergency. Otherwise, keep it off." James took the phone, slipping it into his pocket. "We should head out now," he said, feeling the urgency of the situation. "The longer we stay here, the more we risk being found." They moved quickly, gathering their belongings and making sure to leave no trace behind. Marcus led the way outside, the cold morning air biting into their skin as they emerged from the cabin. The forest around them was silent, the early light casting long shadows across the ground. "Good luck," Marcus said, his eyes locking with James's for a brief moment before turning to Lauren. "We'll see you on the other side." "Stay safe," Sarah added, her voice filled with sincerity. She hugged Lauren quickly, then turned to James. "Let's go." They split off in opposite directions, Marcus and Lauren heading back toward the road where their car was hidden, while James and Sarah made their way deeper into the forest. The plan was simple: disappear into the wilderness, avoid main roads, and make their way to a safe location where they could lay low until the dust settled. As they walked, the reality of what they had done began to sink in. James felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the enormity of their actions now fully apparent. They had exposed a powerful network of corruption, and in doing so, had painted targets on their own backs. "Do you think they'll find us?" Sarah asked after a long silence, her voice barely audible over the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. James glanced at her, seeing the worry etched on her face. "They'll try," he admitted, "but we've taken every precaution. We've got a head start, and Marcus knows what he's doing. We just need to stay alert, keep moving, and not make any mistakes." Sarah nodded, though the fear in her eyes didn't fully dissipate. "I just can't believe it's come to this," she murmured. "All we wanted was to do the right thing, to expose the truth. And now we're running for our lives." James stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "We did the right thing, Sarah," he said, his voice firm. "No matter what happens next, we did what we had to do. And we'll get through this together." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Together, she repeated, the word a quiet affirmation of their resolve. They continued on, the forest growing denser as they moved further away from the cabin. The sun was higher now, its light filtering through the trees and casting dappled shadows on the ground. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but companionable, each step forward a reaffirmation of their commitment to each other and to the truth they had uncovered. As the hours passed, they made their way through the forest, avoiding any signs of civilization. They crossed a stream, navigated through thick underbrush, and kept a steady pace, always mindful of their surroundings. Finally, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, they reached a small clearing, where a narrow dirt path wound its way toward the distant hills. James paused, scanning the area before turning to Sarah. "We'll camp here for the night," he said. "We're far enough from the cabin, and this spot gives us a good vantage point. We can keep an eye on anyone approaching." Sarah nodded in agreement, setting down her bag and beginning to clear a small area for a fire. James did the same, his thoughts already turning to the next steps. They had made it this far, but the road ahead was still uncertain. As they worked together to set up their camp, the forest around them seemed to close in, the quiet settling like a blanket over the world. The night would be long, filled with unknowns and dangers, but they were ready to face it together. And in the distance, the world was just beginning to wake up to the truth they had unleashed. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.